Okay, we will now continue our agenda. Now we will have a speech by Michal Brožka of the Komerční banka or Commercial Bank, and together with him, taking part in the discussion, will be Jan Chadil, the Chancellor of the Unicourt University. They will speak of currency policies and the potential reflections in investment. From the point of view of timing, it won't be possible for Mr. Brožka to take part in the discussion, but if you send him your questions, he will happily answer on the email. So now let's listen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome Michal Brožka, a macro analyst in the Commercial Bank. Hello. The topic of the conference is investment in the digital age. Today is turbulent, as it is termed, and it really is. From the economic point of view, we are struggling with high inflation rate, which we were not used to. We heard of deflation 10 years ago, but high inflation wasn't there. Now it's here. And the question is, how should the central banks respond? Some increased their interest rates. The Czech National Bank did it. And there are countries in which inflation is rather limited. But the second question is, what is your view from the point of view of central banks? Well, you said quite a lot. What came to my mind, really, that the situation is turbulent. We can remind ourselves of the previous fears of deflation. That's why I called my speech the U-turn in currency policies. When banks changed their setting back in 2019 or 2020, there were fears, especially in 2020, when COVID came up, that there will be a deflation spiral, and it will result in recession. And there will be deflation pressures. I have been on the scene for quite a long time. I can still recall 2008 and the Eurozone crisis, and there were fears that there will be no more growth. Now COVID came up and there was a big shock, recession, fears of deflation, and central banks reacted or responded in an expansive way, very aggressively. And that's what caused the situation now, which is quite reversed. We do not have deflation, but we go through a wave of increased inflation. And the reason is COVID and response to it from the position of currency authorities. And another thing is bottlenecks, which are discussed on the side of supply, and that adds up to what happened.
Now, as to whether the central banks should react to it, or whether they will actually react to it, among economists there are different opinions as to how to react. There are some restrictions where the central banks can't do anything about. We are after the period of an extremely expansionist currency policy, and actually the prices are influenced also by the offer and demand. In the US, the inflation rate is 8%. In Europe, it is 7% in average. So, and it is heading up. So, what the central banks should do, they only have to react. Since there are restrictions on the side of offer, the reaction is not fast enough. But there are also many economists who say that this is just beyond the role of central banks, and that there are situations which can't even be found in the academic literature. Whatever our opinion, when it comes to investing, let us ask what are the central banks likely to do. And in the case of the Czech National Bank, there is the increase of the interest rates. Fed also did that. And what is now being prepared is the reverse of the quantitative easing. It is likely to be the quantitative tightening. It is certainly the policy of Fed. It is likely to happen. And the rates of the European Central Bank will certainly grow as well. That will have an impact on investments. You spoke about the quantitative easing. I think that can we expect that it should have an impact on the share markets? This is a timely question and appropriate question. Here we see the development of the Fed balance sheet, that's gray, and the American SAP development, and you can see that there is a long-term correlation, and it's quite logical, because if the quantity of currency in circulation is increased, it can lead, and it did lead, to the growth of share markets in the United States. You can see the markets in 2018. There was a kind of nervousness, flimsiness, and it was just after we were after the period of extremely eased policy. So you can see that there are the periods when the market is nervous, and we do not know whether the increase of the rates by the Fed won't be extremely high. This is the reaction of the markets when Fed is tightening its monetary policy, and but there are other shocks. There is the war in Ukraine. To answer your questions, I think it's irrelevant whether the tightening won't be excessive, because it could result in a recession, but it may not necessarily be so. Fed, if its policy response is properly set, ideally set, it might improve the stability of share markets. As the policy of central banks change, they've already taken some steps, and they are likely to take more, and restrictions can be expected. Can we expect the targeting for lower inflation targets? I think what's worth mentioning is the change or the transformation of the central banks during the past period. Usually central banks are very have big inertia and they don't change easily, but from time to time they do change. Not that they change the mechanism of their functioning, which would make them unpredictable. There are many people who always argue that we should react in this way or that way, but central banks are quite predictable. But the European Central Bank has changed its framework or its modus operandi in the past few years, and they reacted to a period where targeting inflation was very difficult. There were zero interest rates. Oftentimes people said that there are no further means how to ease the policy, and long-term serious consequences were feared. But this has changed now. ECB targets average inflation after the longer period of underrating the inflation target. They can ease the policy for a longer period as well. And there are question tags because this is a running goal or running target. For ECB, the goal was undermined or underlined by the reaction. It depends on the starting point, because while for a certain period of time it was the monetary policy was very eased and the starting point was very low, so the targeting is easier. This can change though, because it can happen that the framework of the monetary policy and the reaction function of central banks could lead in mid-term to underrating the inflation target. There is the risk that the central banks have no other opportunity than do so. So we could find ourselves in a stagflation trap, and some deflation pressures could also appear. But I think that for the time being, we are beyond that mid-term horizon. So the period of underrating inflation is yet to come. When it comes to the instruments of monetary policy, I don't think there exists any optimum way ahead. Not that I know of. What is always a problem is the reaction to stagflation, which may not always have a typical nature which would allow us to determine what instruments should be used. I think that central banks will use conventional instruments, but they could also reach for some unconventional instruments. But interest rates are likely to be recurred to, and I think they will continue to do so unless there is some very strong reason why use some unconventional instruments. There will be one more thing which will play its role in the ECB's decision. Here we can see the long-term inflation expectations. If I look back to the year 21, as we can see, there were many economists who pointed at the increasing growth of inflation, and they asked for the reaction of ECB. I repeat that ECB is still very expansive in its policy. No quantitative easing is appearing, and the interest rates are negative. Many economists ask why what they do now hadn't been done much earlier. Now our inflation in Europe is 7%. On the other side, on the other hand, there is another effect which could result in stagflation. And there are many economists who prone the theory of waiting expectation, of waiting, simply doing nothing. So I think that the inflation target is important. Since 2014, we can see inflation expectations that are the swaps for 5 years, where real inflation is not so much reflected. It's the long term. I wouldn't have believed that ECB would ever be able to come back to the 2% of inflation target, but we had COVID, and as a reaction, there was the monetary and fiscal easing, and we are now back above 2%, which is very important for ECB because the inflation expectations have there is the effect of self-fulfillment prophecy. So there can be an increase of interest rates. Obviously, there are fears of the impact of war, but we can expect that ECB, the exchange rates will go up. The market expects that. So then there are bonds as yet another standard instrument. So what do you think the development of these will be? The bonds and the performance, the prices have been fluctuating quite markedly. As to the composition of a portfolio, bonds seem to count more, be more important. There are also those special features like inflation-protected bonds. The performance of bonds have been growing in the Eurozone. On the maturity, they are positive, which is good. We can have a look at yet another graph. This is the implied Euribor rate and the implied 3 months Euribor. What we can see is the expectation of fast growth, very fast growth of rates in the nearest period. In the long run, the market does not seem to be so convinced. There is even a slight drop, and only then does it grow a little bit. But still, it is under the level where we could expect it to be. It is not above 2%. And all this is transferred or transposed to the expectation of the bond's performance. It's moved, and this is the performance of those who are still before maturity. I'll show yet another graph. You can see the inversion. You can see the Czech implied rates, PRIBOR, and you can see the consequence of the Czech National Bank having increased its rates quite massively. Further increase is expected, the growth of 6%, but drops can just as well be expected, and that is why the yield curves are inverted, especially in the case of the US. I will show them to you. You can see very flat, slightly inverted curve for the USA. There is the curve for the Czech Republic, which is clearly inverted, while for the Eurozone it's still slightly on the rise. So bonds seem to get increasingly attractive. it is appropriate to ask whether recession is not looming, but with the shape of the curve as it stands for the US, many people ask whether this does not indicate the arrival of recession. Of course, this is to be feared. Besides shares and besides bonds, the portfolio of a small investor could further be extended. We were speaking and will speak about Bitcoin and other instruments. But then you have the immovables, which are a traditional means of investing in the Czech Republic. We've been witnessing a very fast growth of this type of investment. What do you think about it? Do you think this is an appropriate instrument? What do you think about the prices? I know it is a difficult question. That's precisely what I wanted to say. I don't dare to make any complex assessment. There are differences across countries, across regions. The reasons why I would expect at least slowing of the further growth of immovables prices is that we have yet another shock, which will certainly disturb the market. There might be some shallow recession in Czechia. I mean, some slight drop throughout, let's say, 3 months in summer, for instance. The question is to what extent people would be willing to use this particular period of 3 months to purchase some immovables. Then there are the interest rates, which certainly will determine the demand. Mortgages, all people don't use mortgages to purchase property. Many people buy it cash or with money they have available. But there was this very sharp increase of the prices of property. And even in the first quarter of this year, the prices kept rising. Last year, the increase of price of flats was 10%. It might be higher this year. And since the interest rates are also going up and the conditions for granting mortgages and loans are stricter, and there is a lot of uncertainty which prevails, it might be that this increase between the quarters in the course of the year will slow down. The development of prices of immovables has a big inertia, like a huge ship. So it might even be that in the years to come there will be a certain drop of immovables prices. Certainly such sharp increase cannot be expected. I mentioned Bitcoin, which is often best perceived as an asset which can hedge you against inflation. What do you think about that? I'm not a cryptocurrency expert, nor am I a Bitcoin expert. I rather handle it as a haphazard unit. Its price does not really depend on economic activity. So I don't think this is a good way of hedging against inflation. I think it's really an accidental thing which can beat inflation. It can happen, but it can also be the other way around. There is no dependency which would be clearly defined. So as a hedge against inflation, it could hardly be considered. Okay, we will hear Dominik Strokal, what he will think about that. Thank you very much for having come and having shared your expertise with us, and I'll be looking forward for the next time. Thank you for having me, and good luck to all those who will invest. Thank you. I just want to remind you there will be time for discussion, and you can send your questions. It was nice to speak about cryptocurrencies at the end of your presentation, because the next presentation will be that by Mr. Michal Brožka from the Czech National Bank.